Logan, West Virginia. Summer of 1932. A cold town running on shift whistles and Sunday sermons, where reputations were as carefully pressed as a deacon's coat, and just as easy to crease. At dawn on a mountain spur called 22 Mine Road, a body lay in the gravel. A woman's. Throat slashed ear to ear. Stab wounds counting upward like a prayer turned inside out. Shoes set neatly beside her, as if someone tidied the scene after breaking it. Her name was Mamie Thurman. Preacher's wife. Policeman's wife. Pretty, sociable, quick with a hello in town. In a place that preached restraint, she carried attention the way a singer carries a note, felt by everyone, discussed by many. Admirers called her stylish. Gossips called her reckless. Both were watching when she didn't come home. By noon, the news ran the hollers, not a robbery gone wrong, not a stranger on the road, but a scandal wrapped in Sunday clothes. Letters rumored. Late-night drives whispered about. Names, prominent names, half-spoken in kitchens and barbershops. The line between church pew and back room blurred the way heat blurs the rails. In Logan, power came with a hymnbook smile and a handshake under the table. Now the town had to decide which hand to look at. Police moved fast. Reporters moved faster. A narrative assembled itself with suspicious ease: protect the respectable, push blame downhill, call it justice. But the facts staggered. The staging. The violence. The insistence that this wasn't random. A preacher's wife becomes a headline becomes a mirror, and the county stares and doesn't like what it sees. And then, because Appalachia keeps receipts when the courthouse will not, the ghost story started. Drivers said a woman in a blue dress walked the shoulder of 22 Mine Road, lifted a hand, and vanished into the trees. Teenagers dared each other to cut headlights and listen. Some swore they heard gravel shift where no foot stood. Sorrow has a sound in these hills. So does rage. Tonight we go back to Logan in the year promises ran out, coal money, church talk, quiet arrangements, and a murder that still won't stay buried. We'll follow the rumors, the trial, the holes big enough to drive a truck through, and the legend that moved in when the truth moved out. If stories like this grip you, don't forget to like and subscribe, because this one begins on a Sunday road and never really ends. In the early 1930s, Logan moved to the metronome of coal. Sirens marked the shift change, company whistles turned mornings into orders. Freight cars clattered along the river like beads on a wire, carrying tons of bituminous out of the hollows toward cities most miners would never see. Money flowed as steadily as the smoke, but it did not fall evenly. It pooled in courthouse offices and in the hands of men who knew how to translate tonnage into favors, political bosses, mine operators, bankers, and in the language of the town it all sounded respectable: development, stewardship, stability. On Sundays, the same men clasped hymnals under their palms, eyes forward, voices tuned to the key of righteousness. The result was a place that wore piety in the daylight and did its bargaining after dark. Churches dominated the public map as neatly as tipples did the skyline. Steeples punctuated neighborhoods built on company land, each congregation a jurisdiction of its own moral police. Posters warned against liquor and loose talk, ladies' circles sewed for the sick, revival tents sprang up in summer like temporary courts of appeal. The vision presented from the pulpit was tidy: men worked, women kept house, children learned obedience, and God's favor followed order. Yet order in a coal town is a carefully managed illusion. Wages rose or collapsed on the tremor of distant markets, sheriff's deputies doubled as company men, and those who enforced public virtue often rented their private hours to appetite. Logan's reputation depended on a choreography everyone could do with their eyes closed: pray, nod, look away. Into that landscape walked Mamie Thurman, with a stride people noticed and a hat pinned just so. She lived in the lane where expectation and curiosity cross, the wife of Jack Thurman, a police officer known for his church attendance and crisp uniform, a man who could shake a hand in town and carry a billy club at night without contradiction. In that arrangement, Mamie held the domestic half of the bargain, presentable, cheerful, active in church socials and local circles. She understood how to host a table and how to be the reason a room brightened when she entered. Photographs, when they appear in memories more than in albums, place her in a neat dress and gloves, a woman who took care with herself because she was expected to, and because she wanted to. Logan's talk about Mamie always carried two flavors, admiration and something saltier. The admiration was public. Women praised her style and sociability, men praised her polish and good sense. She could organize a bake sale with military precision, memorize names after a single introduction, and spot which widow needed a casserole before the widow did. She smiled without simpering, laughed without drawing blood, and left a fragrance of competence behind her that clung to rooms. The other flavor stayed in corners. People who trade in gossip pretend they're passing along warnings, what they're usually doing is rehearsing a thrill. They said she enjoyed attention. They said she liked to drive after dusk. They said, without saying, that some rules are easier to believe when you're the one writing them. Jack Thurman lived in a corridor between duty and diplomacy. As a policeman and a churchman, he served in institutions that were supposed to keep Logan upright, the law to corral human behavior, the church to curate its motives. But any officer in a cold county learns fast that enforcement is less a matter of code than of triage. Fights at the tipple could be calmed with a ride home one night and a fine the next. Bootleggers were enemies until a boss needed a favor. The same courthouse that preached order tolerated disorder when the right hand extended. Jack made his rounds, wrote his reports, shook the right hands. He arrived home to a wife who could recount a dozen conversations from a single afternoon and make each of them sound like a promise the town made to her. Coal prosperity purchased morals the way it purchased marble, generously where visible, sparingly where not. Politicians performed rectitude on the courthouse steps, then disappeared into rooms where deals were spelled out in cigarette smoke and ashtray gravel. Attorneys wore the town's conscience like a respectable coat, removing it for rain. Preachers thundered at dancing and liquor while taking discreet calls from men who paid their pew rents in envelopes. The contradiction wasn't hypocrisy so much as infrastructure, how the place kept itself standing. People learned to live inside it without noticing the strain. A deputy's nod solved more problems than an arrest report. A banker's wink could reclassify a debt as patience. A whispered introduction could slide anyone from the cold side of a room to the warm. If Logan had a constitution, it recognized two branches, appearance and exception. Mamie learned the local constitution as fluently as anyone. To thrive in a town that demanded decorum, a woman had to develop ease, the social intelligence to braid politeness and persuasion. She visited shops as if commerce were conversation and conversation were currency. She knew which church ladies would forgive a missed meeting if they received a compliment later, which usher could be counted on to find seats on crowded Sundays, which grocer could be persuaded to hold back a nicer cut of meat when the train ran late. None of this is scandal, it's competence. But competence in the wrong key can sound like audacity to listeners who tune everything to judgment. The coal economy also bred a climate of watchfulness. Company houses stacked along the creek kept front porches within waving, and eaves within hearing. Windows doubled as proscenium, sidewalks as stages. Any departure from expectation, an unfamiliar car idling after 9, a woman in a smart hat stepping into a doorway that wasn't hers, became a scene in a play the town wrote together. People insisted it was for everyone's safety. It was also, maybe mostly, for entertainment. In hard years, curiosity is a cheaper pleasure than whiskey. What made Logan dangerous for a woman like Mamie wasn't simply its appetite for talk. It was the overlap of its institutions. The church could soft-pedal a rumor or accelerate it. The police could investigate a complaint or file it under fellowship. The bank could extend a courtesy no one else could afford. In a place where power circulates in small rooms and wide smiles, to attract attention is to invite sponsorship and scrutiny in the same breath. Mamie had sponsors, people who genuinely liked her, men who admired her, friends who defended her, and she had scrutiny, women who mistrusted her brightness, men who measured their authority by how easily they could dim it. A coal town's most jealously guarded resource is not coal but reputation. Reputation buys leniency, it buys leverage, it buys silence. Lose it, and the town collects its debt with interest. The logic of Logan in those years could be summarized by a single habit: public restraint, private permission. The restraint was visible: pressed suits, polished shoes, eyes lowered in prayer. The permission lived in euphemism. Helping with church matters might mean a drive after dark. Looking into things might mean an agreement to look away. Keeping the peace might mean not disturbing a beneficial relationship. Everyone understood this grammar, few admitted they spoke it. To an outsider, the place appeared disciplined and devout. To an insider, it was an arranged marriage between image and appetite, a house that stood because its contradictions leaned against one another just so. In that house, Mamie became a figure people placed, here, at a social, there, on a downtown sidewalk, later, seated in a car whose driver's name changed depending on who told the story. The inventory mattered because it kept the town's ledger balanced: what she did that was admirable, what she did that was debatable, what she did that let others write an account they could live with. The same voice that praised her hat in the morning would lower at noon to wonder where she'd driven last night. The same hand that waved on Sunday might point on Monday. In Logan, praise can be a prelude. Sometimes it's the drum roll before a name drops. None of this declares guilt or innocence, it declares context, the air a story breathes before it learns to speak. Coal dust in the lungs, sermons in the ears, money moving under tables, and a woman expert at navigating rooms that expected her to be both visible and blameless. That is the stage. The props are simple: a paved main street, a courthouse with its clock, a half-dozen churches with their bells, a line of cars idling in front of a drugstore where news travels faster than prescriptions. The people are simpler still: those who keep rules, those who bend them, and those who do both depending on who's watching. Admiration, in such a town, is never a destination, it's a threshold. On the other side of the door are whispers, and whispers have a way of finding their subjects. In Logan, the distance from a compliment to a clandestine rumor is about as long as a car ride after sunset. What began as praise for a pretty hat becomes a question about who noticed it first. What began as respect for a social grace becomes a theory about where that grace is spent. And in the summer of 1932, with heat standing in the hollows and tempers short, admiration would curdle into accusation, and accusation into a story the county is still, all these years later, arguing itself out of. If Logan ran on coal by day, it ran on quiet arrangements by night. The same streets that hosted parades and revivals offered shadows generous enough for secrets. In that half-light, Mamie's name began to travel differently. No longer only the compliment passed across a pew, but the sotto voce theory carried porch to porch: she's stepping out. The phrase did not need a destination, it needed only a direction, and Logan supplied many. A policeman's wife, pretty and poised, moving through a town where favor and desire commuted in the same cars, it was a story hungry people could live on for weeks. The rumors had a taxonomy of their own. At first they were about attention: a longer-than-usual conversation on a sidewalk, a laugh that seemed to choose its audience, a hat pinned twice because someone asked for it. Then they promoted themselves to encounters: a ride out of town at dusk, parked lights off on a turnoff not far from where the river makes up its mind. Finally they lobbied for names. This one in a church board, that one in county offices. A man with deeds to sign and money in 3 banks. And, finally, the one that stuck: Harry Robertson, a banker, well-placed, well-married, well-accustomed to people doing what he preferred. Harry's house was a map of reach. It stood on a street where the hedges were trimmed like mustaches and the lamps threw civilized circles on evening walks. His wife managed callers with a tact inherited along with China. Mamie counted herself among the intimates who could ring without offense. The town's memory insists on the galling neatness of it: best friends, afternoon teas, a sitting room where confidences accumulated like dust motes, the banker's shoes in the hall. What began as mutual admiration, 2 women who recognized each other's talent for presentation, turned into the sort of intimacy a small town both cultivates and polices. Even before anyone said affair, people had chosen sides. Outings began to wear a pattern. A borrowed car, sometimes his, sometimes a company man's, tires chalked with mine dust from farther up the valley, appeared outside Mamie's place when Jack was on shift. Errands stretched. Dresses that had looked Sunday bright at a social began to look conspiratorial in lamplight. Gifts accumulated the way weather does, no single storm at first, just a change in the air, a perfume that did not come from the druggist, silk stockings that the company store never seemed to stock, a hatbox without a local label. The logic was practical and the message was not. In a town where wages were measured by what coal did to men's bodies, newness announced itself like a trumpet. Robertson had the professional smoothness of a man whose job was to make other people's money feel at home. He signed loan papers in a tidy hand and poured attention with the same economy. He knew how to listen, the most dangerous talent a man like him can possess, and he knew where to place a woman's laugh so that it sounded like confidence instead of confession. To call Mamie infatuated is to miss the economy at work. In 1932, a woman could trade charisma for provision, the risk borne entirely in her reputation. He risked secrets. She risked self. There were other men, the town insisted, businessmen, a politician with knuckles still blackened by handshakes, a church figure who loved the sound of his own counsel. The list lengthened in retelling because lists become proof when courts are far. But even gossip circled back to Robertson. He had means, privacy, and a sense of permission that comes only to those who have never been told no long enough to learn the shape of it. If a meeting required rooms, he could find them. If it required distance, he could buy it one full tank at a time. Was Jack Thurman blind? Or was he looking away in the correct key for Logan, public restraint, private permission? Versions proliferate. One remembers the late shift that conveniently kept him from his front steps when certain cars idled nearby. Another remembers a wordless scene, Jack, still in his uniform, standing at the sink, the rim of a glass against his teeth, the clock's hand inching toward a time that would make worry sound like accusation. A third claims he knew that the arithmetic of a coal town's salary and a wife's improved wardrobe didn't add, and decided that peace could be kept if the music stayed low. In a county where a deputy's nod could erase a ticket and a pastor's visit could rewrite a man's week, the habit of silence masquerades as prudence. It wasn't only cars and dresses. Letters began to enter the story, notes with a banker's caution and a suitor's cadence. Not the cheap melodrama of lyric, but the office diction of love. I can arrange, it would be best if, speak to no one about. Paper makes intimacy bold. It also makes it durable. When later investigators rummaged through drawers and desks and burned boxes, they found the deposits and withdrawals of an arrangement written in a hand that had signed mortgages. In a safer world, such notes would lodge in a novel as evidence of a personality. In this one, they functioned as fuses. Those who saw Mamie most, shopkeepers, the organist, the neighbor girl who ran messages, noticed a brightening and blanching in quick alternation. She could catch a compliment in midair and pin it to the conversation. She could also go glassy at the mention of certain names. Love, if that's your word, can make even a competent woman reckless. Power makes men careless. The intersection is where roads stop being mapped. Late that spring, a friend swore Mamie used the word afraid about nothing in particular and everything at once. Another swore she said, nearly done with all this. Both recollections are perfectly designed for the future that needed them. The city's elite practiced a ritual older than the mind's, containment. When talk rises, you damp it with denial and decorum. A deacon visits a household, a banker makes a mild joke, a policeman, not Jack, drops by a porch to remind someone that late-night conversations carry, that the county is listening, that discretion protects everyone. The technique works until it doesn't. And it doesn't when the geometry of the secret has grown larger than the rooms assigned to hold it, when cars leave and return too often to be explained by errands, when gifts can no longer be assigned to an annual sale at the company store, when women begin to defend or attack Mamie with a temperature that suggests they're sorting themselves for a trial no one has announced. Robertson's wife, sometimes remembered as Mamie's closest friend, becomes in the retellings either the most wronged person in Logan or the most knowing. Did she read the tide in the parlor? Women often know not by detective work but by furniture memory, what is straight, what is off by an inch. A glass placed too carefully can confess more than a lipstick mark. If she knew, the town took it as confirmation that its script was accurate. Men err and are born with, women err and are names for it. A double standard is a form of architecture here, remove it and houses tilt. Was Mamie in love? The question flatters romance and ignores terrain. In Logan, affection and advancement share a common border. A woman might lean toward a man because he makes the world feel larger, she might also lean because he actually makes it become larger, rooms, routes, envelopes. The map matters. So does loneliness in a place jammed with people. The contradiction is real, you can be adored in public and still feel unsheltered. You can be surrounded and separate. There are reasons a woman steps into a car that begin with agency rather than sin. There are also reasons she keeps stepping back in that begin with something smaller and duller, habit, promise, a man's assurances spoken in a grammar that sounds like weather reports. By June 1932, the rumor had matured into a structure. If someone could have diagrammed it, they would have drawn the banker at the center with lines out to phone exchanges, rooms over shops, a freshly graded lane into the hills, a turnout that looked like a place to talk and was. They would have penciled in Jack's shifts, the choir schedule, the commission meeting, and circled the hours where absence could become relaxed enough to feel like freedom. Secrets prefer rhythm, they get caught when they miss a beat. The danger, in the end, was not that Logan discovered an affair. It was that an affair threatened to discover Logan, to expose how clean collars sit atop dirty arrangements, how tithes are paid with money earned by excusing, how an entire town's self-image can be punctured by the wrong story told in the wrong room. To protect that image, someone would have to absorb the damage. In counties like this, women and black men are drafted first. And so the open secret tightened until it squeaked. Harry Robertson maintained his habits, Jack his rounds, Mamie her brightness and her silences. Handsome gifts learned to look like ordinary errands. Driveways learned to forget tire treads by morning. Telephone operators, who always know more than they repeat, built moral biographies from the weight of a receiver held a second too long. The town balanced on its usual fulcrum, admiration brushing up against envy, piety rubbing shoulders with permission, and waited for the inevitable. It came before dawn on a Tuesday. A road cut high in the hills. Gravel wet with mountain breath. A body laid deliberately, throat opened ear to ear, shoes placed side by side like punctuation. Whatever story Mamie had been living ended in a sentence someone else wrote, and it did not bother to close with a prayer. In June 1932, admiration curdled into scandal and scandal into blood. The town that had practiced looking away found itself staring at 22 Mine Road, and at the list of names its imagination had been carrying for months. Next comes the part the papers love, the discovery, the scene, the shock, and the first pivot from whispers to warrants. Dawn took its time getting over the ridge. On Tuesday, June 21, 1932, fog lay in the ruts on 22 Mine Road like breath that wouldn't leave. A pair of early risers, one headed toward a shift, another toward a patch of blackberries farther up the slope, saw the same wrong thing at the same moment, a shape not shaped like anything that should be there. Gravel tells the truth badly but quickly. What they first took for a bundle was a woman, clothes dark with what the road had taken from her, hair webbed with cinder grit. The posture looked deliberate, placed, not dropped. Shoes, cleaner than their owner could possibly be after such a night, sat neatly side by side where a head should have felt them near. Her throat had been cut ear to ear, the cut deep enough to nearly sever what only the spine stubbornly held. There were stab wounds, too, not the wild scoring of a frenzy but the counted rhythm of someone who had made time for this. The quietness of the scene offended as much as the violence. Death in the mountains is usually loud, rockslide, treefall, train. This looked managed. Word runs downhill faster than water. By mid-morning, the road's shoulder had acquired its own crowd, the curious, the alarmed, the ones who always arrive and later swear they did not. Deputies set a perimeter that in practice meant people stood 5 steps farther back. Jack Thurman had not been the first officer on scene. When he arrived, uniform crisp against all the wrongness, men looked for his face the way people do when catastrophe tests the line between the personal and the public. His wife's name did not yet move through the crowd. It moved through him. The first inventory was simple and terrible. Body, female, adult, placed supine off the roadbed where weeds made a low pillow. Neck, 1 deep lateral cut, clean and decisive, blood loss consistent with cause of death. Torso and limbs, multiple stab wounds, pattern suggesting close proximity and a steady hand. Face, bruising beneath the eye, consistent with a blow. Shoes, removed and aligned, not scuffed as they would be in a stumble or flight. Ground, little dragged, few signs of struggle where she lay, suggesting the killing either occurred elsewhere, or ended with a final, tidy relocation. The work of a first hour is always triage, for evidence and for meaning. Boot prints gained significance, then lost it to the knowledge that half the county had the same soles. Tire marks told 3 stories in the span of a morning: the last car to pass, the last car to stop, the car belonging to the man who slowed down and stayed. One deputy, the sort who studies the nothing as carefully as the something, pointed out that 2 parallel tracks veered toward the shoulder and back to the road again as if a driver had executed a controlled pull-off and return. It wasn't proof of anything. It was a shape to carry. Identification came with speed and hush. A handkerchief monogram that made a circle complete, a piece of jewelry someone recognized, a face in the wrong place that made a colleague old in a second. Mamie Thurman. Wife of a policeman whose fellow officers had begun, on reflex, to call her Mrs. Thurman even before a physician wrote the name down. The announcement did not ring through the crowd, it settled like iron in the crowd, men who'd admired her choosing new words, women who'd criticized her choosing none. A town experienced in reputation now faced its negative image. The coroner did the small, faithful things: temperature, rigidity, an estimate that never comforts anyone. He spoke to the sheriff in sentences meant to carry to a jury months from now: time of death likely prior to dawn, wounds consistent with sharp instrument, placement of shoes inconsistent with a flight or a fall. Later he would add what such men always add to the margin, a note on the care with which she had been left, as if an order-loving hand had wished to tidy the disorder it made. If a ritual existed, it was organizational, not religious. Reporters arrived with notebooks held like begging bowls. They learned the hill's acoustics within minutes: a whisper near the ditch could carry to the pine stand, a question asked at the wrong volume sounded like an accusation the wrong person would answer. Editors love contrast as much as the law loves sequence. By lunchtime they had both: preacher's wife in one line, throat slashed in the next, coal town in the first paragraph, placed shoes in the second, Logan's morality held up against the staging at the roadside like a pair of mismatched gloves. The roadside itself offered clues that argued with each other. No purse in the immediate area, no obvious theft, rings, if any had been worn, were absent, but absence can be robbery or removal. No drag marks to the shoulder, the body might have been carried or killed where it lay. Blood pooled beneath the neck wound, less spray than spread, stab wound suggested close assault, possibly seated or restrained before the cut. Shoes position betrayed familiarity, many killers who stage do so clumsily. These were aligned, heel to heel, toe to toe, like habits saying goodnight. Speculation, always the county's fastest craft, shoved off: robbery, jealousy, a warning. Jack himself could not be insulated by uniform from the arithmetic any thinking person would do. A policeman's sphere is influence and resentment in equal measure. A policeman's wife, bright and well-placed, accumulates the same. Names arrived on the wind like weather, some anonymous, some prominent. The fact that the death had been measured rather than chaotic encouraged a particular kind of whisper, message, not explosion. People who write messages often sit nearer the front in church and closer to the center at the courthouse. If the scene was composed, what did the composition intend? The shoes won the argument for intention. A woman's shoes are extensions of her public self in towns like Logan. To set them together, tidy, beside what remained of their owner read like either mockery or mourning, someone who knew her habits of neatness, or someone who knew about women's reputations and wanted the last word in presentation. A deputy, low-voiced, said what others were thinking. Either way, someone cared how this looked. By late afternoon, 22, Mine Road was both crime scene and pilgrimage. Teen boys took the long way home to walk past the deputies and memorize where the body had been. Women came in pairs, the way women do when they need to look and then talk with a witness in the passenger seat. The sheriff had them pushed back twice, both times the boundary leaked like a sieve. What the town could not keep from seeing, it would try to contain in speech. The press went to work at its two crafts, fact and frame. The fact admitted no heroics: woman found, wounds described, husband a policeman, investigation underway. The frame did the other thing papers do, it married the road to the rumor county. Well-liked socialite, church-going, stylish, admired, all the adjectives that had surrounded Mamie in life were decked around her in death like funeral sprays. Then came the quotes from officers, no immediate suspects, following all leads, asking the public for information. The town read the papers to see names it already knew not printed there. Back at the road, someone found cigarette ends crushed out half on the gravel, half in weeds, the small archaeology of idleness or nerves. A bit of fabric snagged on a low branch made a deputy reach for his pocketknife and a wax paper envelope. Tire prints gained definition in the afternoon heat, a tread pattern the courthouse later could name. The ditch downstream betrayed nothing useful, a storm 2 nights before had scrubbed it. If there was a murder weapon, it wasn't there. If there was a witness, she had already been carried to town. Even a killing has a timeline. Investigators built one in chalk on a blackboard in the back office that evening, lines and ticks and names now written in initials. Where had Mamie last been seen? Who had seen her with whom? Who had motive to silence a woman whose visibility had become its own kind of force? It is not improper to say the list at the top skewed upward, toward men with envelopes, not men with wrenches. The coal camp yields its own crimes, knife and liquor and jealousy, but the care at the scene pointed the other direction, toward rooms with doors that lock softly. Jack gave his statement as carefully as if he were writing a sermon line by line. Hours the night before. Routes she might have driven. Calls he had or hadn't made. Silences that sounded different when retold under a bare bulb. The men listening weren't cruel. They were working. An officer's precision is both shield and sieve in such moments. Detail saved can also be detail weighed. A friend put a hand on Jack's shoulder, the gesture looked kind and felt like a pinning. In the churches that night, the prayers stumbled. Pastors reached for psalms of protection and found their tongues slow on the words. The women who had admired and envied Mamie in equal measure sat with programs crushed in their fists. The boys who smoked on the school steps took turns telling their own versions of the roadside and improved the story each time. If ghosts could be made by attention, Mamie would have had one by midnight. But for now there was only the road, the ditch, and a set of shoes that argued louder than any voice. The county had seen shootings. It had seen men broken under rock and timber. It had not often seen a woman laid out like a statement. That is what unsettled the ribs, not just the killing, but its grammar. Someone wrote tidy where the world expected mess. The day ended the way it had begun, the ridge swallowing light slow as a held breath. Deputies rolled the crime scene tape back from the brush and drove away in pairs. Tire tracks turned the road into staves, waiting for a melody the county would spend the summer inventing. People slept with windows open because the heat demanded it and dreamed closed because fear suggested it. Somewhere on a desk in town, a list of names learned to carry itself like a verdict no one could pronounce yet. By the time the ink dried on the day's last report, suspicion had already left the roadside and headed downtown. Strangers did not make statements like that, neighbors with influence did. The next chapter would move from the gravel to the parlor, from the road into the rooms where favors are made and stories are shortened. Logan's elite, the banker with the careful pen, the men whose names lived on letterhead, would feel the first cold gust of inquiry. And the county would learn again how easily justice can be aimed, and how quickly a scapegoat can be chosen. By the second morning, the investigation had learned to spell its nouns with capital letters: banker, handyman, preacher's wife. What drifted in whispers toward the parlor now walked there with a warrant. Officers crossed the threshold of Harry Robertson's fine house the way men step onto a rug they know is worth more than their boots, careful, brisk, pretending not to notice the room taking their measure. Politeness went first, then drawers. What they found allowed the road to speak indoors. The list wasn't theatrical, that's what made it persuasive. Articles a woman would carry, where they did not belong. Fibers and stains where a tidy home would rather have had none. Notes with a banker's hand and a suitor's grammar. An article of clothing some swore they recognized. The officers marked, bagged, counted, and in counting built the prosecution's favorite noun, proximity. If a killing is a story, proximity is its transition, how a noun becomes a verb. Robertson watched with a face practiced for depositors and deacons alike, concern without alarm, dignity without heat. He explained what he could and let the rest sit like furniture. So the law, remembering its other grammar, reached for a second figure: Charles, sometimes Clarence, Stevenson, called Petrie by half the county, a black handyman who ran errands, drove, fixed things that needed fixing and some that did not, the sort of man a house like Robertson's keeps on its quiet payroll. He was picked up, questioned, and, after hours that get longer in the retelling, confessed, or so the papers said, and so the courthouse would later hear. Confessions, like ghosts, come in kinds. There's the kind that runs clean, details no one else knew, motives that fit like a key in a lock. And there's the kind that accumulates by suggestion: what if this happened, Petrie? What if you saw that, until the speaker is repeating the questioner's syntax back to him with the punctuation moved around. What Stevenson said in that room, and why change with the witness, you ask? In some versions he killed her outright. In others he only helped carry the body. In still others he took the blame because blame is a currency, and in 1932 Logan a black man's account could be depleted without anyone blinking. Arrests came in a pair. Robertson for questions no one believed would stick, Stevenson for the charge everyone understood would. The town inhaled. Churchmen vibrated with the effort of not making statements. Bank men exhaled platitudes about cooperation. The sheriff did what sheriffs do when the wind wants two different flags: he planted both and said the weather would decide. The grand jury obliged the county's appetite for hierarchy. Papers framed the matter as two tracks: the banker, calm, composed, guarded by counsel, and the handyman, poor, black, alone under lights that make even innocents sweat. The prosecution, reading the hunger in the gallery as a man reads a weather map, chose its path. Try the handyman for murder. Keep the banker close enough to feel heat and far enough not to blister. If the public clamored, show them evidence from a rich man's home but teach them to tie it to a poor man's neck. Jury selection moved like a metronome nobody could stop. 12 white men, farmers and clerks and one or two who could shape their hair with pomade, raised their right hands in a room hot enough to persuade a confession from a hymn. Stevenson's counsel performed the motions defense lawyers perform when the deck is stacked, questioned prejudice politely, asked for change of venue with a voice that already knew what the answer was, objected when the state offered statements gathered in the hour when night turns men pliable. The court kept to the tempo it had chosen, brisk. The state's case did not attempt poetry. It did not have to. It walked the jury from 22, Mine Road to Robertson's parlor to a table where items lay under glass and then to a transcript where words lay darker than the ink. It read Stevenson's confession in a voice stripped of doubt. It summoned men who said they had seen a car where no car should be. It invoked stains and fibers and the half-literate science of the moment with the confidence of a preacher laying hands. It gestured, with a kind of legal shrug, back toward Robertson's house. We found this there, ladies and gentlemen, but what it proves is who handled it last. If the defense had a shape, it was dislocation. The lawyer tried to peel the roadside from the parlor, to open a gap wide enough for reasonable doubt to slip through. He said the confession was coerced. He said the timeline bent in places only guesswork could supply. He said Robertson was in this whether he liked it or not. The room listened the way a church listens to a visiting minister, not inclined to change religion but willing to be polite. Meanwhile the papers, eager to keep the show running, printed Stevenson's words the way playbills print lines, as if remembering them correctly were the same as believing them. Outside the courthouse, Logan rehearsed the oldest pageant in America, race and class fusing into a verdict before the jury had even sat down. White men with envelopes standing on steps made a line that mirrored the one inside. Black men on the sidewalk shifted weight the way men do when they already know what a day will bring. Women came in pairs and threes, some in shock, some with their chins set, all of them experts in watching rooms decide what does and doesn't count as a woman's life. The prosecution called Robertson just enough to have his name hang in the air like a perfume and then dismissed him with a courtesy that felt, even to those who wanted to be fair, like a favor returned. Cross-examination went soft around him, like stepping off a boardwalk into sand. With Stevenson, it went the other way, a series of questions that permitted only yes or no, the courtroom's cruelest instrument. When he hesitated, the state read from the statement again as if it were scripture and the witness were a man in need of straightening. Somewhere between an exhibit and an afterthought, the race of the defendant did its work. Not in the text, rarely in the text, but in the subtext, talk of servants, of obedience, of knowing his place, of doing as he was told, each phrase a brick laid without mortar into a wall a juror could lean on when the law's sentence felt too thin. The story the state sold was simple and useful. A white woman had been murdered. A black man had confessed to touching the scene. The rich white man in whose orbit both had moved would stay in orbit, not a participant. The county's order required it. Before verdict, there is always a day when everything in a case depends on weather, a thunderstorm that keeps people home, a heat that thins tempers. On that day, the jury went out, the room exhaled. Men in shirt sleeves loosened ties. A deputy leaned his chair back and looked at the ceiling the way men look at the sky when it will not give rain. Jack Thurman sat as if each minute had a weight attached to it and he had volunteered to hold all of them himself. Robertson sat as if minutes were a currency he could, if annoyed enough, print. The jury returned like a creek returning to its banks. Guilty, they said of Stevenson, not the gallows, but life. A punishment that satisfies a town's appetite for process without risking an appeal that would run hot enough to burn fingers. Robertson walked out by a different door, bearing charges that read to the public like manners, things a gentleman pays to make go away. The courthouse became itself again, public building, not theater, so quickly the room got whiplash. What people said on porches that night did not match the docket. Some called it justice, more called it a trade. The earth at 22 Mine Road weighed more than one man's confession could lift. You could feel, in the way the town stood up from supper and drifted to steps, that belief and acceptance were not the same thing. Belief requires proof. Acceptance requires habit. Logan is built on habit. The newspapers obliged habit by printing an ending they could file. The state obliged habit by moving the prisoner where prisoners go, and by letting the banker return to rooms where curtains are drawn against talk. The church obliged habit by finding a psalm that sounded an awful lot like a sigh. The people who loved Mamie had no habit to lean on. They had absence, and a road, and the sound of gravel under a car rolling slowly to a stop and then starting again. Was Stevenson a killer? A helper? A scapegoat? The record supplies multiple answers, which is a lawyer's dream and a historian's ache. The single answer it provides with consistency is that power kept itself upright. Evidence that brushed Robertson was rearranged the way a parlor is rearranged for company, chairs angled to show off the piano and hide the stains in the carpet. The trial proved what the town already knew about itself and refused to say aloud, that race and class are not simply facts in Logan, they are tools. A man inside the courthouse whispered to a reporter as they stood near a window, if she'd been a different kind of woman, and he a different kind of man, this would have gone different. The sentence lingers because it says nothing and everything. Kind here means position, permission, protection. The chord a town strikes when it wants harmony more than truth. A conviction does not complete a story, it sometimes only camouflages it. Stevenson went to prison, Robertson went back to his life, and Logan went to bed with its doors locked and its windows open, practicing the skill it knows best, cover. But the scene showed. There were holes in the timeline big enough to drive a coal truck through, names that fell out of the record the way a man's card falls out of a hat when the trick is done, silences that sounded rehearsed. What the court closed, the county reopened, in rumors, in private reckonings, and, before long, in the only court that never adjourns in Appalachia, the ghost story. Next, we read the ledger for what's missing, the cover-up and the questions it could not bury. The docket closed, the story didn't. Logan is good at endings you can print and bad at the kind you can live with. In the weeks after the verdict, people began comparing notes the way families compare recipes, quietly, carefully, with a little substitution. What they discovered was not a single missing piece but a pattern of absence, items that should have been logged, statements that should have been fuller, names that should have sat under oath but found seats elsewhere. Start with the evidence that breathed Robertson's air. It was inventoried, some of it, not all of it. The list the jury saw was respectable, neat, and incomplete in the way respectable things often are. Certain personal items linked to Mamie turned up in his house, their chain of custody moved quickly past discomfort, as if the law were willing to touch them only long enough to pass them to Stevenson's side of the scale. When questions arose about why other items had not been tested or traced, the answer relocated itself, misplaced, contaminated, not material. Three phrases that function like trapdoors in any investigation: open, drop, forget. Then there was the matter of statements, who gave which, when, and why they changed tense in retelling. Telephone operators remembered calls at hours that made the timeline fidget, not all those recollections made it into sworn testimony. A neighbor's porch recollection, car lights doused on approach, a horn tapped twice in a way that sounded like a password, surfaced in talk and evaporated at the courthouse. A shopkeeper recalled wrapping a last-minute purchase nobody could later find. Each scrap, on its own, is nothing, together they describe drafts of a narrative that never reached publication. The confession that secured the conviction bore the fingerprints of its hour. Anyone who has watched men questioned under bright bulbs and long watches knows how syntax starts to echo the room. Details that only the killer should know are the gold standard, details anyone could learn by living in Logan are something else. Stevenson, poor, black, positioned at the bottom of a ladder he had never been taught to climb, produced a document that prosecutors read like scripture and many townspeople read like a receipt, payment to the pressure of the moment. The law declared it enough. The county's older memory, less easily convinced, filed it under convenient. Against this drift stand the holes, negative space that functions like evidence when nothing else will. Where exactly was Mamie last seen, and with whom? The paper trail shows spurts of precision, this time, that corner, that phone exchange, and then goes blurry where specificity would embarrass the wrong person. When was she killed? The coroner's window is broad enough to admit several versions. How did she reach 22 Mine Road? Two cars fit the tracks if you squint, the one that didn't fit belonged to nobody who mattered. Why the shoes? Theories multiply, then cancel. A message? A kindness? A mark of someone who knew her living habits well enough to imitate them in death. It is in these gaps that the word cover-up learns to pronounce itself. Not necessarily a single meeting in a lamplit room with cigars and a plan. More often, it is the quiet consensus of men practiced in keeping things tidy, a banker who understands how to encourage silence without entering it, a pastor who knows which rumor to preach against and which to smother with a prayer, a sheriff who calibrates resources toward the case that will close neatly. The mechanism rarely requires an architect. It requires only habit. In Logan, habit arrived in pressed trousers and nodded to everyone in the foyer. Race and class made their contributions like ushers guiding people to seats. Stevenson fit the part the system wrote for him, available to blame, vulnerable to pressure, useful to closure. Robertson fit the part the system preserved, essential to the town's financial bloodstream, surrounded by men who owed him favors or expected them. The legal language stayed neutral, the outcomes did not. When the defense tried to ask whether other names had shared Mamie's company and whether those names had receipts that could not stand a public light, the court found ways to narrow the questions until they fit only one man. It wasn't just that a black defendant was convicted. It was that the entire geometry of the case arranged itself to make that outcome look like order restored. Look closely at the timeline and you can hear the gears slip. What time did Mamie leave downtown? Who saw her before midnight? Which engine idled under her window and for how long? A deputy's notebook mentions a late-night drive up a lane that now everyone insists is too rough for the car in question. A gas station hand swears a gentleman stopped for fuel around the time the coroner later would fix as perilous. His signature under the statement is neat, but his boss's signature under it is neater. The ledger of the case balances for court, the clock of the case refuses to. There are also the names that fell out. Early talk included 2 businessmen and a church figure whose civic generosity had purchased generations of discretion. By trial, the list had shortened to Robertson by proximity and Stevenson by design. One man's name became background, present but uncharged, like wallpaper that insists on itself without being looked at. The other's names migrated from conversation to caution, and then disappeared into that Appalachian archive where locally known truths go to wait for funerals. If you listen long enough to a place, it will tell you what kind of truth it can tolerate. Logan can tolerate a jealousy killing. It can tolerate an outsider to blame. It cannot easily tolerate the proposition that a web of respectable men, the ones who tithe, who employ, who stand stiff at parades, might have been involved in undignified logistics, notes passed, cars borrowed, alibis polished. A cover-up is not always an insult to the facts. Sometimes it's an act of self-preservation by a town that cannot afford to examine its foundation while the mine whistles still need to blow at 6 a.m. Even the paperwork's tone tells on itself. Where documents touch Stevenson, the adjectives grow sharp, coarse, surly, evasive. Where they touch Robertson, they round off, distressed, dignified, cooperative. Language is a tool. In Logan, it was also a screen. The court printed an outcome, the community printed a hierarchy. What, then, of Jack Thurman? The file leaves him stranded in a painful middle, husband, officer, believer in an order that could not return his belief with equal fidelity. Those who want a simple tale of betrayal and revenge draft him as a dupe. Those who know how towns work draft him as a man doing difficult arithmetic, the price of pushing against a structure that pays your wage, the cost of asking the wrong man the right question. His grief is the one part of the story that does not require a theory. And Mamie? She is the center that would not hold and will not be granted a still point. In the official record she becomes a sequence, victim, the word that flattens every contour. In the unofficial record she becomes a warning, what happens to women who live brightly where the town prefers dim. The justice she received was a verdict that many called adequate and many more called arranged. The justice she did not receive is the straight line between name and act, drawn in ink thick enough to hold. The case, as it stands, teaches a lesson the hills have taught before: when truth is inconvenient to those who steward image, truth will be shortened. The files will get thin where they should be fat. The witnesses who could widen the picture will be deemed unreliable, unavailable, unimportant. And the place, needing a conclusion to sleep, will take the one that does the least damage to its mirrors. When the courthouse cannot carry the weight, the work shifts to other rooms. In Logan, it shifted to the road. Stories began to gather there at night, the kind that say what minutes and memoranda will not. A woman in a blue dress walking the shoulder. A hand lifted, a face blurred by fog, the gravel whispering under invisible feet. If the living rearranged the facts to save themselves, the ghost, people said, kept the original order. And so the legend of 22 Mine Road took up what the record put down, turning an incomplete case into a story that refuses to end. Stories collect where the record thins. On 22, Mine Road, the first retellings arrived before the wildflowers finished with summer. Drivers said they saw a woman in a blue dress walking the shoulder, palm raised at chest height as if to steady herself or to ask a question no one could hear. Headlights lifted her out of the dark, made her pale as river fog, and then, this is the part that repeats, she wasn't there. Gravel still whispered under what should have been feet. The rear view showed only road. In Logan, ghost lore does not need permission from the courthouse. It needs a place, a name, and people who can't stop passing either. Mamie Thurman gave the legend the first two. The third, traffic, took care of itself. Coal roads are lifelines, the living have to use them. As pickups and sedans shouldered that grade, the sightings organized themselves into categories the way evidence does on a prosecutor's table. Type 1, the walker. A figure in a blue dress appears just beyond the splash of low beams, pace unhurried, steps precise, as if she were balancing a cup that mustn't spill. Drivers tap brakes, roll the window, ask if she needs help. The figure raises her hand, some swear it's a wave, some an instruction, and takes a step sideways into the ditch the way a person yields to a car. When the driver checks the mirror, the shoulder is empty. The detail that keeps people telling it is courtesy. Even dead, they say, she minds the rules of the road. Type 2, the hitch. Teenagers hunting adrenaline pick the hill after dark. They park at the bend, kill the headlights, and wait. If they've brought someone they intend to impress, they add theater, a blue scarf knotted to the antenna, a spare pair of women's shoes set side by side on the dash. At 10 after the hour, always 10 in the stories, one of them sees a woman lift her arm from the verge, thumb not extended like a hitchhiker, palm tilted like someone asking to be seen. They lurch forward, nerves ahead of the clutch, and coast alongside. Glass down, breath held. You all right? Silence. Then a voice, sometimes a sigh, sometimes nothing at all. They swear the back door clicks. When they gun it to town, the car feels heavier. They don't look back until they reach the bridge, where the rules say passengers must be counted. The seat is empty. The weight is gone. The smell left behind is wet cinder and cheap perfume, two notes that don't belong together and won't leave. Type 3, the warning. Miners on night shift tell the quiet version. On the climb toward the turnoff, their lights pick out something low and bright on the shoulder, a pair of women's shoes placed heel to heel, toes to the road. No figure, no other sign. Just the shoes, tidy as prayer books. When they slow, the motor coughs. When they stop, the shoes are gone. Men who work 20 years in darkness and don't spook easy have avoided that stretch ever since. They'll take an extra 2 miles of grade to keep their radios from crackling there. The ghost's wardrobe is a town argument. Some say blue because blue is the dress they remember seeing Mamie in at a social, some because the color refuses to be confused with white shirts and dust. Others insist on white, because ghosts in stories wear white, and the hills have been tuning to that color so long it might as well be law. But ask the drivers who swear they saw her at their bumper's edge and they'll tell you the truth, in a headlight's wash, fabric doesn't have a color. It has shape, a hem, a sleeve, a sway that tells you this is a woman moving with intention. What makes her Mamie is not dye. It's place and need. Folklore compiles rules as neatly as case law does. By autumn the county had a field guide. Don't drive the grade with high beams, she dislikes glare. Do travel with a second person, she appears more often to pairs. Don't pull onto the shoulder, keep tires on the road, seatbelts on, hands visible. If you speak, ask the question she was never allowed to answer, do you want me to tell the truth? If you hear gravel move and see nothing, do not fill the silence with talk, wait. The waiting is the point. Theories followed as predictably as ivy follows fence. Skeptics said the temperature drop up there at night, cold air pooling in the cut, fogs the mind. Others chalked the walker up to misread moonlight, or a deer on the shoulder, or an afterimage from town lights blinking on and off in the valley. The most practical blamed adrenaline and adolescence. Fear can make a curve seem haunted 100 times and turn a Sunday dare into scripture by Monday. But ghost tales in the coalfields do more work than startle. They sort the story the courthouse could not, motive from rumor, gravity from gossip. On 22 Mine Road, the haunting rarely mentions Stevenson or Robertson by name. It doesn't need to. The categories, woman, violence, staging, power, have become sediment. The apparition is the county's way of rebalancing weight. If court language assigned the heaviest burden to the easiest shoulders, the road returns it in kind. The blue dress bears nothing. The living bear the rest. Every October, the legend renews itself. High schoolers launch night runs up the grade with new drivers and borrowed courage, telling the story in the voice they inherited from their older siblings, who inherited it from theirs. Someone produces a tape recorder, now a phone, hoping to catch the click of the car door or a breath soft enough to be replayed. Parents, who once did the same drive, stand in kitchens and bite back the urge to say be careful, they say be home by 11 instead. The ghost keeps a curfew no one enforces. Adults have their versions too. Nurses on back roads home from swing shift, mail carriers cutting a mile off a route, a preacher who prayed all the way from the turn to town and will not admit it at Sunday supper. Once, a deputy, the kind who laughs at kitsch and keeps his dashboard neat, pulled over at the higher bend because a woman in a dress waved him down. He swears he saw blood on her collar. He swears he heard her say tell him to stop. He scanned the woods with his flashlight beam like a metronome and found only birch trunks and eye shine. The story cost him a night's sleep and bought him the habit of looking at his passenger's seat after he turns the key. A legend needs keepers, and Logan obliges without calling them by that name. A tour guide from town adds the stop to an October route, voice dropping on the approach so the bus hushes itself. A librarian stacks photocopies of old clippings and circulates them under the heading local history rather than true crime. The museum keeps a pair of 1920s pumps in a case, no provenance, only suggestion, and places the placard just so. None of this is official. All of it is memory work, the living arranging our attention where the paperwork refused to linger. Why blue? Because the story chooses what the record won't, tone. Blue is sorrow when the preacher says it. It's warning in a rearview mirror. It's the color of a bruise that has learned to live farther under the skin. The dress is a way to see a person the file compresses to victim. On the road, she is walking. Whatever else is taken, that verb remains. And for some, quietly, privately, the haunting is a form of petition. People go up there and ask for what evidence refused, names to match to acts, courage to carry through, mercy for the parts of a life the town judged too quickly. A sighting does not fix a docket. It does something smaller and, in the hills, sometimes more valuable, it gives an order to grief. Walk. Wave. Vanish. Repeat until the living learn the pace. Not every driver sees her. That is not failure, it is criteria. The ghost appears most reliably to those who arrive with the two qualifications any witness needs, attention and honesty. If you come with bravado, the road obliges you with nothing. If you come with your window cracked and your radio down and your mind refusing the easy versions, the shoulder fills with possibility. And if nothing else happens, the drive home still teaches the oldest Appalachian lesson: the silence between trees is not empty. It waits. Folklore can hold what files drop. But it's no substitute for a ledger balanced in daylight. In Logan, the ghost keeps the story awake, the legacy decides what to do with its eyes open. After the walks and warnings come the reckonings, how the case exposed the county's class, race, and gender math, how Mamie became both scandal and symbol, how tours, songs, and side glances keep her present on maps and in mouths. That's the last work of this tale, to say what the haunting has taught, and what the living have chosen to remember. A town decides what it remembers by what it repeats. Logan repeats Mamie, sometimes as a caution, sometimes as a prayer, sometimes as a dare told at midnight on a switchback road. The case file settled into drawers decades ago, thin where it should be thick. The story never settled at all. It kept walking. In barbershops and sanctuaries, on porches and school buses, it learned new emphases while keeping the same outline: a woman praised in daylight, policed after dark, a killing staged to look like a statement, a verdict that read like order more than truth. That outline exposes the town's arithmetic. Class counted first: who could afford discretion, who could be made to carry the consequence. Race set the terms of closure: a black handyman fit the system's demand for a name to put under punishment, even as a banker moved through the narrative like furniture too heavy to shift. Gender finalized the equation. Women lived within rules written by men and enforced by women. Break them and you became both headline and moral, judged more for brightness than for harm. Mamie's life, tightened to a phrase, preacher's, policeman's, wife, became, in death, a mirror for the county's public piety and private permissions. In that mirror, people still quarrel with themselves. Some insist the case proves what they already believe about temptation and punishment. Others read it as a brief against the way small powers protect themselves by sacrificing the nearest disposable life. Most stand somewhere in between, where memory is more friction than verdict. They admired Mamie, they gossiped about her, they mourned her, they repeated the parts of the story that kept them safe. Communities are not juries, they are choirs. They sing the melody they can manage and leave the hard intervals for the next generation. The work of memory shifted, over time, from courthouse minutes to culture. Church girls told the ghost story with a tremble they half believed. Teachers used the case as a capsule lesson on Appalachian history, how industry shapes morals and how morals shape excuses. Local writers and tour guides kept the road in circulation, the way a hymn keeps a doctrine alive when the sermon goes stale. A pair of vintage pumps under glass, a photocopied clipping in a binder labeled "Local," a October bus that hushes itself as it climbs, all small liturgies of remembrance. There is danger, of course, in the Gothic. It can varnish what should stay splintered. It can turn pain into product, reduce a woman to a blue dress and a vanish. The counterweight is precision: to say Mamie Thurman before we say ghost, to say June 1932 before we say legend, to hold the names of men who benefited from forgetting alongside the name of the man who paid for the town's forgetting. Folklore has its uses, but it should not be allowed to launder accountability. And yet folklore has a gift: facts envy, duration. It keeps a room lit after the clerk goes home. Because the road is still there, the story can't quite leave. Teenagers stage the dare and, in doing so, stage the question adults still dodge: who gets believed, and when, who gets protected, and why. Parents tell them to be careful and mean two things at once. Ministers preach fidelity and hear, in their own cadence, the echo of a case where fidelity alone wouldn't have saved a woman who needed a different kind of protection, a town willing to tell the whole truth even when it embarrasses its sponsors. So what remains? A ledger that won't balance. A blue dress that may be memory or may be light. A county that understands itself better in the retelling than it did in the trial. And a woman whose name will not thin to a single lesson. If she is a symbol, let it be of two things at once: the ease with which reputations can be weaponized against women and the stubbornness with which communities can still be called to an honest accounting. That double meaning is the only fair monument available when stone won't do. Final image. Night on 22, Mine Road settles like breath you can see. The pines hold their black. The gravel keeps its small voice. Somewhere a driver kills the radio and coasts the bend, window cracked to listen. There is no apparition tonight, only the shape of a shoulder where a woman was laid like a sentence the county still can't finish. The road teaches what the file couldn't: that silence is not an end but an obligation. To tell the story straight. To carry the name. To refuse the convenient version, even when it lets everyone sleep. Mamie Thurman's murder endures not because we lack endings, but because the right one hasn't been earned. It sits at the crossing of betrayal, injustice, and haunting, asking the living to choose which they will allow to speak for them. Whether in the courtroom's stale air or on a mountain road at midnight, her name refuses to fade, and in that refusal, Logan is given its chance, again and again, to be braver than it was.